Welcome to the Gaslight Effect Podcast. I'm Robin Stern, co-founder and associate director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence and author of the best-selling book, The Gaslight Effect. I'm an educator and a psychoanalyst, but first and foremost, I'm a wife, a mother, a sister, aunt, and healer. And just like many of you, I was a victim of gaslighting. Please join me for each episode as I interview fascinating guests and explore the concept of gaslighting. You'll learn what it truly means to be gaslighted, how it feels, how to recognize it, and how to understand it, and ultimately, how to get out of it. Before we begin, I want you to know that talking about gaslighting can bring up challenging and painful emotions. Give yourself permission to feel them. Some of you may want to go more deeply with your emotions, while some of you may hold them more lightly. No matter what you're feeling, know that your emotions are a guide to your inner life. Your emotions are sacred and uniquely you. Respect and embrace them, for they have information to give you. If you want to listen to other episodes of the Gaslight Effect podcast, you can find them at robinstern.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for being here with me. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Gaslight Effect Podcast. Today, I'm really thrilled to introduce Melissa Duge Spiers. And Melissa is an award-winning essayist, a screenwriter, an advocate for topics of religious abuse and resilience, using her online platforms, and she'll tell you about them, to raise awareness and help others to find healing. Melissa, welcome. It's an honor to have you. And thank you so much for just bringing your story to the Gaslight Effect podcast. Please tell our listeners all about you.
Thank you so much for having me. I am a fourth generation Seventh-day Adventist, which is an extremely high control religion. They would call themselves a basic Protestant Christian organization, but they are truly an end times cult. And so I recently published a memoir that we'll talk about probably toward the end, Holy Disobedience, about being raised in this high control system and how I left at 18. And I just thought I was free and clear. Leaving equaled healing. And that was totally, I went on and I went to Barnard College and I had a series of glamorous jobs and thought I was just, the cat's meow. I was totally fine. And then in midlife, I realized that I had been dragging with me all of the high control programming in my secular life. And that was extreme submission training, behavioral and thought control, basically, that taught me to always look outside myself for direction. And that had really, I had manifested that in a series of extremely narcissistic, abusive, controlling relationships with older men throughout my life. So then I really had to go back and deprogram myself from the religious side and see how that connected. High control religions groom you basically to be the perfect victim for narcissistic abuse, gaslighting, etc. So I'm really excited to talk about that today because I don't think it gets enough coverage. And, I would argue maybe that generally all religions are a bit involved with gaslighting. I mean, if you kind of look at particularly Christianity, like the "what would Jesus do" thing, that's such a little meme. That's teaching you to look outside yourself to kind of gaslight yourself. Don't trust what I think. What would Jesus do, and then kind of try to guess what that might be. So I feel like we could talk about this all day. I'm really excited.
Well, I'm ready to dive right in. So starting with your first few sentences. So when you were growing up
Yes.
in this cult, and what did you notice early on in your life, or did you notice early on in your life that there was a discrepancy between your personal truth, or there was tension between your personal truth and what was being told to you or what you witnessed around you?
Yeah. I noticed very early on. So Seventh-day Adventists have, first of all, a prophet, of course, like every true cult, they had a prophet, and she was part of the founding of the church in the mid 1800s. And so the church largely, and certainly my family in particular, followed her instructions to the letter. And she had millions of them. She had controls for absolutely everything, behavior, diet, looks, thoughts, etc. Um,
Melissa, can I ask you who was in your family? Did you have siblings?
oh, sure, yes. So I have an older sister, and then so our family was my on both sides of my family, it was my great grandparents who got us into the organization. So it had gone generationally down. And when I was young, everyone on in the extended family was Adventist as well. It's interesting, my generation has largely left the church now, which is a whole phenomenon on its own. The third and fourth generation in cults often escape. But I was the younger of two daughters, and I was the strong personality. And so I got a lot of the extreme control thrown at me with, violent physical punishment, etc.
So tell us some of the rules that you live by.
Okay, so the Adventists have they have a few things that they think really sets them apart from other Christians, the not true Christians, right? Everyone thinks they are the only true Christians. So Seventh Day obviously is a big part of their "we're so special." From they follow the biblical, the Jewish traditional rules of like from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday is the Sabbath, and basically you're not allowed to do anything but worship God. So we were not allowed to do any physical activities. Well, there were actually, and this is part of the gaslighting of high control religions, is the rules were so minute and so changeable that you never quite knew exactly what was permitted. Like we could go hiking on Saturdays because that was participating in admiring God's handiwork, but you couldn't go swimming, you couldn't go running, you couldn't compete in sports, but you could possibly go sailing. So there were just all these, and you always had to kind of walk on eggshells, kind of guess, because a lot of it was unspoken. Also, the prophet had a bunch of rules, but then every family, every community enforced it just a little bit different. So there was this hyper vigilance of what the rules actually were. So that's one of the things that they pride themselves on that sets them apart is their observance of the Sabbath. Also, dietary rules. Most people have never heard of Adventists, but they have heard of like the blue zones, or yeah, so that is an entirely owned by the Adventists. They are so proud of themselves. They are the only North American blue zone. Loma Linda in California is an Adventist center. And their dietary rules, going back to Ellen White, their prophet, is vegetarianism. Um, no, obviously no alcohol, no tobacco, the usual kind of prohibitions. But then we were raised very strictly according to it, where you couldn't have any spices either, because Ellen White had declared that um, anything that inflamed your body would inflame lust and bodily desires, and you didn't want that. Like sex was a huge no-no, right? So we were raised without mustard, without pepper, um, and certainly no caffeine. So again, you were always hyper vigilant in terms of, did you accidentally consume something that was sinful, that was horrible? Um, and when you're a kid, um, all of those things that are presented to you as bad are equated with sin also, and you don't have a register of what's bad sin or okay sin or whatever. So accidentally consuming something that had pork in it, for instance, terrified us. My sister and I would just cry and feel like we were going to hell because we had accidentally consumed pork, you know.
It's so disturbing and scary to think that you and so many other people grew up like this. But so first, who is Ellen White? But before you answer that, and like, how did she get to be the prophet? And also, how did she communicate, or how were you communicated with about all the rules? Is there a Bible? Is there, like, is it on the wall? Like, how do you even know what some of the rules are?
Yeah. So Ellen White was one of the founding members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's interesting because even to this day, they will not ordain women, but yet she is the figurehead of Adventism. So a very strange dichotomy there, but she they were part of the Millerite movement, which was this mid 1800s guy named William Miller decided the Daniel and Revelation predictions. He had calculated them out that God was going to come back in October of 1844. And so the Millerites were all waiting for Jesus to come in October of 1844. Of course, when he didn't show up, he missed the bus, then that movement kind of splintered, and Ellen White and the Adventists kind of sprang out of that. And by the time she was about 20 years old, she was leading the church. And the funny thing about her is that she was hit in the head with a rock when she was 9. And now everyone is fairly, at least anyone with critical thinking skills, is fairly certain that she then suffered temporal lobe epilepsy, and she definitely had a major traumatic brain injury. She was in a coma for quite a while. She had lifelong seizures and hallucinations, and she interpreted those as from God, which often comes with temporal lobe epilepsy, I've learned, a heightened religiosity. And there you have it. So her brain injury really started a religion that is now 25 million people worldwide, which is about 4 times larger than the Mormons, actually, but nobody has ever heard of the Adventists. It's quite interesting. And I don't know that much about epilepsy, but I do know that there are various different kinds of it. And I guess the one that comes with a temporal lobe injury comes with a specific set sometimes of symptoms. And for Ellen White, she also manifested hypergraphia, which proceeds into how we knew about all her rules. Was she wrote hundreds of books, thousands of letters to parishioners that are now bound into books. I mean, she was also a well-known plagiarist, so she copied a lot of that from other people at the time, but even so, her output was prodigious, just like, and no detail was too small for her to micromanage. And one of the classic, so I was kind of reviewing like classic gaslighting and how religions do it this morning. And one of the really classic things that she would do and that the Adventist Church still does today is you need to have a personal relationship to God. You need to really develop and read your Bible. That's the only thing. But don't interpret it any differently than I'm telling you to. Just she would smack people down if they even thought that they had an original interpretation of anything. No, no, no. It was her interpretation or nothing. And the Adventist Church still does that largely to this day, in my opinion.
So were you unable to voice thought, like to disagree? So I mean, you're describing a situation, an emotional situation where there's no room for disagreement, for original thought. We would say that's not a psychologically safe place to grow up, and it sounds like it was not at all. Not only were you mentally controlled, but also use physical abuse. And how did that happen? And why would anybody be physically abused?
It, yeah, I mean, absolutely times 1,000. It was not okay to ask questions or to trust yourself. And again, Ellen White's writings were very big on that. Do not ever trust your own thinking, your own strength, your own understanding. That's the way the devil gets in.
Gaslighting 101.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally. And only trust the Bible slash God, but only as I tell you it is, you know? Um, and then there was also, it's a classically very patriarchal structure. So the man is the head of the household, under him is the wife, and then under her are the children. And our family was very much that way. And my mother was extraordinarily strict and controlling herself. So we had this double layered system. And that's where a lot of the physical abuse came in, was my mother did not brook any disagreement with what she said. In my book, I give an example of, we had to look an absolutely certain way. So again, there was this mix of family and church. Like the church wanted you to look modest, and all the purity culture rules and just all of that. But then my family had this very specific, we also had to be beautiful and skinny, and in a very specific way that my mother prescribed and her mother had prescribed for her. And so our hair had to be wavy in a very specific curl, which obviously I do not have. And so we would be forced from as early as I can remember. So, 4 or 5, we would be forced to have these home permanents, so that our hair would hold a curl. And so it was this whole thing. And so I would get beaten if I tried to resist the perm. And so that kind of circles back to what you had asked of, like, how did I know in the beginning there were problems with the system? And it was things like that, where I just knew in my little child body that what was being asked of me was ridiculous. I knew that nobody cared about whether my hair was straight or curly. Supposedly, God gave me that hair, right? And so there were all these rules that just, I didn't know how to question. I knew questioning would get me punished, but there was this building cognitive dissonance, and just again in your body feeling of, this is not right.
When you had that feeling, Melissa, what would you do with it?
Oh, well, I mean, the very sad part of it is that both my sister and I, of course, developed eating disorders. I learned very early on that my body was really the only thing I could control, under their entire huge system of everything. We we were very much, we didn't have televisions, we didn't have radio, we weren't allowed to listen to popular music, we weren't allowed to watch movies.
Shut the
Uh,
world out.
yeah, keep the world out. I mean, classic cult. We just didn't live in a compound. It's just all the rules were our compound.
How did you all keep in touch with each other? Like, did you belong to a church group and then you
Yes.
all went to church together?
Yes. So, yeah, I should have explained that a little bit earlier on. So, the Adventists, it's a very insular, like, you're taught to fear anything outside, anyone who's not Adventist is like, very, don't be in the world, of the world. So they have developed their entire ecosystem. Like, they have their own publishers, they have their own food, like they make vegetarian meat, they have their own radio, that's approved radio and music, etc. Now they even have their own television station. Of course, back then we weren't allowed, we didn't have any of that. But and they're one of the largest medical systems in the world and one of the largest educational systems in the world. So we did not go to public school. We didn't do anything out in the world. We had our own, there was a group called Pathfinders for Children, which I wasn't allowed to join, but most kids did, which was like
I've
a
heard of it.
high,
Yeah.
okay, so it's like a Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts type of thing, but it was Adventist. And you had your own Adventist summer camps, you had your own everything. And so we went to Adventist school all our lives, and then we went to church. And most of the time, we lived in communities that were largely Adventist. So it's basically, it is a classic cult structure. It's just there's no, Waco compound type element to it. But
Did you have friends who you talked to where you would say, this doesn't feel right? Or even between friends, you weren't allowed to speak that?
I didn't even feel comfortable saying it to my sister. It was just you didn't. In high school, I tried to have a few conversations with my father, just asking basic questions like, if God is so good, why does he let bad things happen? Just those average things. And of course, you just got shut down with, you don't have enough faith, you don't have enough trust in God, don't ask those questions. Um, and then in high school, I did try to, I tried to write a critical thinking paper one time, asking if the ends justify the means in the story of Esther, because obviously she joined a harem and she saved her people. And so I was like, so it's okay sometimes if you're part of a harem, if you're,
How
doing
brave of
sex work.
you. That's amazing. Oh my goodness. The story of Esther. I love it.
And so I got shut down. It was so not worth it for me to have done that. I learned very quickly, like, all the meetings and the concern and the prayer, and I had to be prayed over, and I had to be lectured by the Bible teacher about how, I was again asking questions that you can't ask of God, and blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't like I got outright punished. It was much worse. It was just a flooding of lectures and meetings and prayer and blah blah blah. And I thought, okay, I'm
Flooding
gonna,
saying, what's wrong with you? Like, what are you
yeah,
doing? This is wrong.
right,
And
right.
so, what was there any rationale for that? Like early on, like we don't question God because, or we don't have any different thoughts because, or there was no because.
There really was no because. It was because Ellen White said, don't trust your own understanding, don't trust your own strength, don't. That's how the devil gets in. And so that was kind of the classic response as far as I ever got was, um, and you'll still see it today in like Adventist stuff is, God works in mysterious ways, right? And we are faulty humans and we don't understand his works. And so if you're questioning and you're finding fault with how God is doing things, the problem is you, and perhaps you're entertaining Satan.
Entertaining Satan would mean that you yourself would become the devil incarnate, that you would, or that the devil would work through you somehow because
Yeah.
you then, okay. And that must have been like, terrifying.
Absolutely terrifying for children. And I mean, I can't emphasize enough how, in retrospect, and again, I think all high control religions are uh, abusive to children, to the children being raised in it. Not only did we fear that the devil was going to get inside us if we accidentally ate pepper, right? But we were also taught that drum beats were devil music, which is also extremely, extremely racist. But it was that the devil gets into your soul through that pounding beat. And so anytime you heard a pounding beat, even if like a car drove by with the radio on, you, as a child, you thought, oh, did the devil get in? Um, but we also had this other layer, that is the end times cult part, where we were taught that Jesus is coming back in our lifetime. So you had to be hyper vigilant any minute. You had to be ready and pure and blameless for Jesus to come back, or you might not be, taken to heaven. You might not be a chosen one. Um, so there was that, but we were also taught that really classic end times thing of we were going to be tortured for our faith, and our parents were going to be shot in front of us to test whether we would give up our religion. And, we would be rounded up and faced with interrogation about, will you give up the Sabbath? It was all about the Sabbath. There was going to be this law that the Catholics and the devil, basically, working through secular governments, were going to enforce Sunday worship all over the world. And anyone who didn't worship on Sundays was going to be rounded up and tortured for their faith. And are you going to give up Sabbath worship? And, as a 5-year-old, that was terrifying. I wet the bed for years as a child, and those were my nightmares. So it's absolutely abusive in so many ways.
And it is absolutely the opposite of healthy development, absolutely the opposite of, when I talk to people about, well, how do you nudge yourself into a place where you're reclaiming your reality? Well, you begin to find moments where you can trust yourself, where you can say, I know this to be true about me, and no matter what you say, I know this to be true. And you're taught never to do that. So there's no way out until you realize this all is gaslighting.
Yeah, exactly. And then, even though I realized that fairly early on, in my late teens, about the church system, I didn't realize that programming and my complete submission and my lack of boundaries, right? I mean, we were not allowed to have boundaries. And I didn't know what a boundary was until I was in my 40s. And I'd been giving up my agency mostly to partners, to men, my entire adult life. And it was all from that training, that upbringing. I didn't think I had the right until I was nearly 50. I often didn't even know what my feelings were, because it had not been a safe thing to express as a child.
And you weren't allowed to have feelings that weren't blessed by Ellen White.
Right, exactly. She was I mean, there is a quote that I love to give about her, because it so encapsulates that control and abuse, where she literally, I think it was in a letter to her own son, her own child son, who she said that one unhappy child will ruin heaven for everyone. So as children, we grew up thinking if we were ever unhappy, we would prevent everyone from getting into heaven. So we weren't, and in our family, I would get hit with a hairbrush or a cello bow or whatever was at hand if I was unhappy. So, I can't overemphasize how much that programming just formed who I was for my entire adult life, even though the religion was long gone.
And it breaks my heart to know that that you had to go through this, to know that so many thousands of young people are going through this, and how wonderful and courageous you have been, and the gift you're giving the world of your story and your book, and your scripts and your articles, and thank you. I mean, how incredible the work you're doing. I wanted to ask you about your dad, because
Yes.
you did spend quite a bit of time talking about him in one of your writings, and I think and given that you had challenging relationships with men when you left, and I would say that the ghost of gaslighting was following you. I mean, and maybe
Totally.
it's kind of a playful way of saying it, but it's very serious, that you just couldn't let it go in the, okay, I'm done with it now. It doesn't work that way, and you lived that. And so where was your dad in all of this?
It's really interesting. So my father was largely kind of um, absent in our lives. He worked all the time. He was, when I was a tiny child, he was a Seventh-day Adventist youth pastor. He had gone to the seminary and he was a youth pastor. And then when I was about four-ish, 3, 4, he quit being a pastor and we'll get back to that. And he went to the Adventist medical school. And so most of my life, my thinking, cognitively present life, he was a doctor. And then he retired from medicine very early when I was in my early 30s, maybe, and went back as a retirement job to being an Adventist pastor again. And so that that arc is important to talk about later on. But so he was this, I call him like an Adventist unicorn. He was both a pastor and a doctor, which are both very revered in the Adventist church. And he still preached all my life, even though his day job was being a doctor. And he was an Adventist missionary then, because um, their biggest success, honestly, in converting everyone all over the world is that they sweep into underserved communities in the westernized world, but mostly now in developing countries. And they offer, they build clinics, they offer medical care, they build schools, they offer education, they offer English lessons, and so Dad could do both of those things. He could preach every Saturday, but he could also do the medical part, and he could, help with the schools and all of that stuff. And, so obviously they are just decimating Native cultures all over the world by sweeping in with basic necessities with the price tag of become an Adventist, right? And so Dad was very revered in the church as far as I ever knew, and um, he was very charismatic. People just adored him, and so did we. When he was around, we just thought he was magic. He was funny. I got my love of reading and learning from him. And we just thought he was the cat's meow. And Mom, on the other hand, was extraordinarily strict and abusive and humorless. And so I grew up my entire life thinking Mom was the bad guy and Dad was the good guy. And then that's where the arc of his career comes in, because when I was in midlife, uh, he had just been in his retirement pastor job for a couple of years, and he called and said, I need to talk to you. Sit down. And I was like, wow, okay, this is not the usual conversation with my father. And he told me that as a youth pastor, when I had been a tiny child, he had been in a series of he had abused young girls in his Pathfinder and youth pastoring jobs in the Adventist church. The church, in the classic church fashion, just moved him around, and he repeated a couple of times until they finally removed him for good. And that's when he started his medical career. So when he had started this second pastoring job in my midlife, one of his original victims found out about it, and she called the church, basically the church management structure, and said, no, he cannot be in charge of a church. No, you guys knew about this way back when it happened to me when I was a child, and you must know about it now, and he needs to be removed. And so the church agreed to remove him if she wouldn't sue and she wouldn't go public with her story. They didn't really enforce that. He went right back to preaching and stuff. They just weren't paying him anymore. So I tracked her down, and I found out who she was, and I befriended her, and she was really the beginning of pointing me not only to looking at my dad through just telling me their story, and how that had structured my relationship with men, but also just she was the one who first really criticized the Adventist church to me. And I had just left it and I had never wanted to hear. I was just like, oh, anytime Adventist or anything about religion came up, I was just like, don't want to hear, don't care. And she was like, you really need to look at this. You're not healed, basically, at all. The church damaged us all, including your father, in so many ways. And unpack it, dig deep. And so I've been doing that for the past 15 years.
That's quite something that you became friendly with her and that she was an agent of healing for you and set you on a path. How did you initially get out before you met her? Like, what was the breaking point or the like, no more, I'm done?
Um, my senior year in Adventist Academy, I figured out, and again, already had that pattern of I can control my body. That's the only thing I can do, and I was a cutter. I was pulling my hair out. I had eating disorders, I mean, there was just everything. And so I fixated on the purity culture side and the fact that they were all so terrified of
I
all
have
the
to ask you
abuse.
about the purity culture because
Okay.
that was a new word when I was reading about you and reading what you write. And I mean, not that I haven't heard the word purity, but I didn't know the term within the cult um, situation.
Yeah, it's now like since I left, it has become a very well kind of acknowledged part of evangelical Christianity and stuff. And it's codified. I guess there are purity balls where girls father-daughter dances and people wear purity rings and stuff. Of course, we had none of those things because we couldn't dance, we couldn't wear jewelry, we couldn't whatever. And we predated that term, purity culture. But basically what it is everyone is supposed to stay pure until marriage. It's also very anti-LGBTQ. It's just heterosexual, etc. But the underlying thing is the purity really only applies to women. It's supposedly for everyone, but we in particular we had all of these group breakout sessions during weeks of prayer or during religion. We had marriage and family class where it was just hammered into us that women's sexual purity is their value, basically. And if you don't stay pure until marriage, you are giving as our religion teacher said, you're like the wrinkled, sweated in, stained, crumpled, stomped on shirt in the men's dressing room floor that all the other men have tried on. And who's going to want to pick you up and wear you and buy you? Men want a shirt that's clean and new in the package. And
Is
that
this
was
your
supposed
metaphor, or this is something they would tell you?
that was what our that was our religion teacher's favorite example.
Wow.
Yeah, that was what we were told. We were also told that you're a chewed piece of gum, you're a rose with all the petals ripped off every time you have sex. There were a
Uh-huh.
bunch of these things that we were told.
And did
But
you have special underwear like in the Mormon church?
no, no, we did not at all. We just had underwear control in terms of like bra straps couldn't show, cleavage couldn't show. You certainly couldn't have any underwear showing, all that kind of control, but we didn't have special underwear at all. Um, so with that purity culture programming, as a senior, I had been a good girl. I was a type A and I had done everything perfectly right because I didn't know if I even believed any of that, but I knew it was going to get me where I wanted to be, which is not being prayed over and not pulled into, conferences like my one attempt at writing a research paper. And it also meant that maybe I could get out. And I didn't know how I was going to do that. But so I started with sex. And I just thought they're all so, so scared of sex. And what can I do? Like, obviously, I couldn't go get a tattoo, or I couldn't wear jewelry, or I couldn't start chowing on pork ribs or something. That would be visible, but I could have sex and nobody would know. And so I knew I couldn't do it in the Adventist system because, again, everyone would know. So I literally had never, I mean, I'd only kissed like two boys before my senior year a couple of times. And I just was like, gonna go find out what this is all about. So I went down to the public school and I found a really cute boy there and found out where he worked and walked in and introduced myself. And, 2 weeks later, I had shredded my virginity and I was done with that purity stuff. And, you know, I, I proved to myself, which I thought was so amazing. That was my breaking point, was like, see, all their rules are stupid. All of the stuff they tell us are dumb. None of it I knew none of it made sense to begin with, but I'd proven it with sex. Like I didn't feel because they told us, of course, your soul will have the imprint of every person you sleep with, and you give away a piece of your soul every time you sleep with someone. And I was like, see, that didn't happen. I'm fine. But what it did was, I never learned to associate love with sex. Then, it had become this thing that was outside myself that they controlled anyway before I ever got a piece of it. And so from then on, it was just something that I could give or use or traipse through, just like, and the worse the better. If sex was bad, I was going to fetishize like making it really bad. So then I got in all of these kind of kink S&M type of relationships where I was just, abuse me because somehow that felt like I was getting back at the church. And of course it was just not healthy for me, but it took me, again, decades to realize that. But that was the breaking point. And that was when I was like, none of their rules apply to me. I'm done. And my parents and I had a series of a couple of years where after I graduated high school, they wanted me to go to Adventist college, and I would refuse. Um, uh, and eventually I won and I ended up at Barnard. And from then on, I tried never, ever, ever to think about religion in any way after that, until it all kind of came crashing down.
So when did you decide to write and speak and as part of your healing journey?
Um, I had always been a writer. I was an English major in college. I had always wanted to write. Oddly, I never thought I personally had anything to say. I didn't have any interesting stories, either fiction or nonfiction. So most of my adult life, I just wrote little articles about other things. I wrote about extreme sports or, whatever, for magazines and stuff. And then when I got that phone call from my dad, so that was 20 plus years ago, 25 years ago, I guess. I started writing. I took a memoir class and I was like, I'm just going to write about this. And I didn't intend to publish it. It was just my way of processing because that's what I knew how to put things in words. Um, and then, let's see, it was right around COVID. I entered a contest that was for unpublished manuscripts, just as a lark, because we were all looking for things to do in COVID, right? And I had been writing this memoir off and on, but mostly off, after, for 10 years at that point. And I thought, oh, I have an unpublished manuscript, I'll enter it. And so I entered it in the book pipeline unpublished manuscript nonfiction category, and I won. And I was like, oh my gosh, And I thought, well, now I should really do something with it. So I got an agent and I started, polishing it up. And at that time, again, kind of the combination of the agent telling me I needed a platform, an online platform to sell the book, but also because COVID, you just weren't doing anything. So I got my Instagram and my TikTok going. And I just started out talking about this weird religion that I grew up in. I just wanted to kind of make everybody understand what the kooky rules were and stuff. And it kind of was just to amuse myself. But it very quickly became quite heavy, and people started. I was one of the few visible ex-Adventists, and so people started telling me their stories, and more often than not, they were sad and horrible, and either like mine, of just the super hyper control and vigilance, and the abusive childhood, or there were sexual abuse cases. And I personally had not been sexually abused, so I was able to kind of hold space for those people without it, re-traumatizing me every single time. And so I started listening to people's stories. I started lists of all the stories of the Adventist abuse cases because I just felt like someone needed somewhere, just even privately, to acknowledge these people's stories. And that just grew and grew and grew. And now I advocate for victims of Seventh-day Adventist church abuse. there's a big, huge lawsuit that just started in January that I was able to help. I was able to actually give them some of my lists and help them start with this history of the abuse in the church. And now my platform is big enough, I was able to announce when the lawsuit came out and help them get publicity and other victims to join. And now with my book, I'm really, really hoping, and I say this as a joke, but I really, truly mean it, that I hope in 5 years, my book is obsolete. I'm obsolete because there are so many ex-Adventists telling their own stories out there. I want this to be the opening of a waterfall, of a flood, because there are so many horrible stories that need to be heard. And this enormous organization needs to be seen, needs to be exposed.
What a beautiful dream. And what a beautiful dream and hope, and how amazing the hope you're offering other people. Um, if I can help as an expert in gaslighting in any way, if I can put an article on your site, if I can, if just in any way, help to you in any of the cases you're working on, you'll please let me know. I'd be honored.
Thank you. That is wonderful.
It's just staggering, actually, to hear your story and to just think about the enormity of the problem and the people growing up who are actually being trained to undermine themselves, to not trust themselves, to not feel what they feel. When all of my work is about giving yourself permission to feel and honoring yourself and trusting your and saying when I feel like something's wrong, something is wrong.
Yeah, and I know we don't have time to cover it, but again, it's in my book, but all that programming ended up with me in for 10 years in my 40s until 5, 6 years ago. I ended up in a very long abusive relationship with a diagnosed cluster B. I mean, he was a psychopath, and I obviously didn't know that when I got love bombed into the relationship. But the just like you were saying, like I didn't trust myself to see the warning signs, the flags. They were all there. Everything he did was classic. Um, and I didn't know it. I didn't know it for 10 years, So it's huge. The people raised in these, and I know it's Adventism is an extreme version, but I would imagine Mormon women raised, anybody in the more strict evangelical corners. That's what we are force fed, and it has lifelong ramifications.
Anyone in a at the extreme of any religion
Yeah.
is in a gaslighting relationship because there are so many rules and so many prohibitions, and there's only one way. And I, one of the things, and I'd love to have you back at some point to talk more about it, because one of the things that I think is not well understood, even though I've begun to write a little bit about it and people talk about it as well, is the cult of two, how the ghost of gaslighting follows you into your life, and then you end up in a different kind of cult, and it's just the two of you. But you
Yes.
find yourself like walking on eggshells or not being able to give yourself permission to feel because it's not really, there's no safety in the relationship. And so I'd love to have that conversation with you down the road. And in the meantime, where can people find you, Melissa?
Okay, so I am, well, let me, just, we can, so this is my book, Holy Disobedience, Sex, Sin, and Secrets in the Biggest Church No One Knows. And that's available anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org. You can order it at your local bookstore, which is a great thing to do. It's on Audible also, which I got to read myself, which just makes me so happy that I'm telling my story to people personally.
Yes.
But and it's a ebook also. So any format that you want.
And when I finish it, I will call you and then we'll reschedule. So
That would be awesome. Oh, I would love it because we can talk about that one-on-one cult. Oh my goodness. Got lots of stories about that. But I have a writer. I don't have a website. I have a Substack, so it's just my name, Melissa Duge Spiers. And then I am on Instagram and TikTok, and that is where most of my ex-Adventist and narcissistic abuse and religious trauma content is. And that is The Glory Hole, WHOLE, which is my little play on words, as representing what high control religion can do to people. So The Glory Hole, WHOLE.
Thank you so much, really, for the gift of your presence this hour, for telling people your story, and for offering healing and hope and a pathway out for people who are stuck. I really respect and admire and your bravery, your courage, and you're just wanting more for yourself, a full life.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining me for today's episode. I hope you found it helpful and meaningful. If you want to listen to other episodes of the Gaslight Effect Podcast, you can find them at robinstern.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. And please leave a rating and a review. I also invite you to follow me on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. I'm so grateful to have many people supporting me, and especially grateful for all of you, my listeners.